The 10th Congressional District of Illinois, located in the suburbs north of Chicago, has been as well served or better by its congressional representation as any other district in the nation, regardless of party affiliation. Listen to the names: Republican Donald Rumsfeld, Democrat Abner Mikva, Republican John Porter, and our guest here today. Our guest today has served as a Naval Reserve intelligence officer during conflicts in Iraq, Haiti, and Bosnia. He has served 4 tours of duty at sea and 3 in Panama. The United States Navy named our guest today Intelligence Officer of the Year in 1999 for his combat service in Kosovo. He also served as an air crewman over Iraq as part of Operation Northern Watch. Our guest today graduated from New Trier High School before earning his bachelor's degree from Cornell University. He also holds a master's degree from the London School of Economics and a law degree from Georgetown University. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the City Club of Chicago, Congressman Mark Kirk. Congressman? It's all yours.
Thank you, Jay, and I want to thank the City Club for inviting me. This is a big deal for a new congressman to come before this group. We regard downtown Chicago as a part-time part of the 10th Congressional District, since I think about every morning 20% of the district moves here, and every evening it leaves. I am happy to talk about a number of subjects. I'm looking at Michael, thinking about talking about life as a Republican, supporting the Non-Discrimination Act, or key environmental topics where I've sometimes differed with my president. But today I want to talk about foreign policy, because it's on everybody's mind. And what's going on overseas is apparently topic A for us. This is a vital topic for the Illinois economy because our state is home to the #1 and #2 exporter in the nation. That quiz question is filled in by the names Boeing and Motorola. And so when you look at foreign policy and the export position of our state, 1,000 miles from saltwater, what happens overseas affects the incomes directly of Illinois families. I want to talk about a short-term topic and a long-term topic. And when I talk about a short-term topic, read Iraq, the topic A in Washington. Now, as you heard, in 2000, I flew against the Iraqis. I remember looking out the window of our aircraft, seeing clouds over the target area. And I said to the pilot, I didn't know that we were going to have any weather. And he said, "That's not weather, stupid. That's anti-aircraft fire." And so I went up against the Iraqis then, and we saw a trend. Flying against the Iraqis in the 90s, we saw just limited 60-millimeter anti-aircraft fire that would explode at a 10,000-foot altitude far away from us. But flying against the Iraqis in 2000, it was all 100-millimeter anti-aircraft fire, the full-blown 12 o'clock high experience that you saw in the movie, and a number of surface-to-air missiles fired at us. And we felt that Iraq was back. You could feel the money surging into the Iraqi government and being spent on armaments, and then being shot at us. So in my life, as a naval reservist flying against this military, and as a congressional staffer, I became concerned with Iraq very deeply. Now, as a staffer, I helped draft parts of the Iraq Liberation Act. You know, it's been part of our lexicon now to say somehow we are against regime change in Iraq. But we have to remember that the Iraq Liberation Act was introduced into the Senate by Senator Lieberman, to his great credit, and it was signed into law by President Clinton, to his great credit. And it set our country on the policy to change that government. Now, as a member of Congress then, with an entirely new administration, we confronted this issue directly. It's rare for a freshman to be chosen as one of the 9 members who are on his inner circle for looking at the issue. And I spent a number of weekends, both as a reservist working in the Pentagon and in the tank in the White House, reviewing our options and what we should do in Iraq. My advice was very clear to the President that we had to get congressional approval. He could not go it alone from inside this government. And we had to get a UN Security Council resolution. We could not go it alone as a sole government. Those were enormous policy constraints at the time, because if you remember, the Senate was controlled by the other party. And by forcing him into the congressional box, that meant that he had to get bipartisan support. As much as a couple of candidates for president now would like to forget, I remember being in the Rose Garden with Senator Lieberman and Congressman Gephardt, and it was to their credit that they stood with the president on a key national security issue. After the congressional vote, we went to the United Nations and worked long and hard on UN Security Council Resolution 1441. It took 7 weeks to negotiate. And while they would wish you would forget, the governments of Russia and France and China all signed off on that resolution. So now we find ourselves on the other side of a key congressional vote, a key UN vote, and a war in Iraq. As I look forward, I want to focus on several key principles that I think should govern our policy there. Principle number 1, the war on terror must be fought overseas and not in America's cities. Principle number 2, when we deploy our military, we should fight to win. Number 3, America's victories have always taken longer and are more expensive than we first planned. And number 4, our policy must reflect our high ideals, that Iraq must not invade her neighbors, that she should govern by the consent of her own people, and that it should one day be an ally of the United States. Let me talk about the first principle. We must fight overseas and not here at home. That's almost axiomatic when you come from Chicago, home to the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere, targeted by al-Qaeda and still standing. I stand as a North Shore congressman who represents thousands of constituents who work in the Sears Tower and wonder whether they'll be able to come home at night. First job of the government is to ensure that they do, and to ensure that our proud heritage as a leading city, as an architectural city, can continue without fear of some foreign threat overseas. Second principle, we must fight to win. The last decade shows that if we leave work undone in the Middle East, then we condemn a future generation of Americans to refight a whole war all over again. I think we should hang in there this time so that Americans don't have to go back and do this again in another decade. Therefore, I am in favor of the President's proposal to provide the tools to the soldiers to win. Next principle, it takes longer than always initially expected and is more expensive. Remember, the Civil War was going to be over by Christmas, and they all said that about World War I, too. When we look at the lessons of U.S. occupation, it does indicate, even in the middle of a 24/7 immediate gratification news cycle, that we have to have patience. Look at the record of this country. It invaded her neighbors 3 times on 3 separate generations, was never a democracy, and represented a mortal danger to the United States and our allies. Who am I talking about? I'm talking about both Germany and Japan, who had no democratic tradition and for 3 separate generations had invaded just about each one of their neighbors that they could. Imagine in 1946 an American politician saying, I've got an idea. We're going to make Germany into a liberal democracy and ally of the United States. If you remember the time, the most popular plan in the Midwest of America, I think supported by Colonel McCormick, was not that plan. The plan that he wanted to back was the Morgenthau Plan. And that was, forgive my English, to castrate all young German men and deindustrialize that country because it could never be trusted and had shown a record of disrupting world peace for generations. President Truman rejected that advice, and he built a liberal democratic country in the heart of Europe. Maybe more surprising because we didn't lack a cultural heritage, the same thing happened in Japan, a country that had murdered about 1 million Chinese people in the previous decade. We say, well, how long did these occupations take? When you look at the Japanese occupation from when Douglas MacArthur rolled in to the first Japanese election was 13 months of U.S. occupation. But there, the task was somewhat simpler because we decided to leave the entire Japanese government in place, and in fact even left the emperor in place. The more instructive lesson with regard to Iraq is how we handled the German occupation, because we set it as our policy to denazify Germany. And after a generation of dictatorial rule, that meant wiping out nearly every level of the German government. Between the victory in May of 1945 and the first German election was, anybody know the answer? 4 years of direct rule by occupation of the United States. So as we look at the de-Baathification of Iraq and the potential that we have there, from May 1st to now, about 20 weeks, what have we done in 20 weeks? Well, we have scheduled for the arrival of 20,000 peacekeepers to come into the country, led by the Polish army. And the Polish government got a very severe talking to by the government of France, saying, why are you breaking European unity and signing on with the United States? And the Poles responded, because our experience with dictatorship is much more direct than yours, and we're siding with the Americans. Secondly, we are moving from 30,000 Iraqi policemen to 90,000, because we know the only real way to protect American soldiers is to deploy the Iraqi police force to patrol their own streets. The Coalition Provisional Authority, which is the UK-US government there, has provided already 4 million vaccines for the Iraqi children. We know that if we had elderly Iraqis who depend on state pensions not paid, it would cause desperation in Iraqi families. We pay 2 million Iraqi pensioners on time. We have now had elected town councils in 95% of Iraq cities for the first time in 35 years. And look at the physical condition of Baghdad. When we took over, we did not realize this at the time, Saddam Hussein had skipped offering any sewer services to the 5 million people of Baghdad since 1989. That led to the highest infant mortality rate of any country in the Middle East by Iraq. Next month, 2/3 of Baghdad citizens will have clean water for the first time in a decade. So, that is what has been accomplished in 20 weeks. For us, I think as we go forward, we need to implement our policy as I described, a government that does not invade its neighbors. Remember, the previous government of Iraq killed or injured 1 million Iranians just next door. Also had disappeared 5,000 Kuwaitis who are still missing. And now we've discovered 3 mass graves in Iraq. We made a promise to ourselves when we liberated the camps after World War II of never again. It wasn't an open-ended promise, but it was a promise to stop that sort of mass killings where we could. Now, everybody says, where are the weapons of mass destruction? Well, as an intelligence officer in the Pentagon, I think I'm the only member of Congress that was on active duty during Operation Iraqi Freedom. I read a lot about this, and I will mention one bit of common sense. Where are the weapons of mass destruction? Well, he had weapons of mass destruction. He had them just before the war, and we know that to a biblical certitude. How do we know? Because Saddam Hussein told us. In his December 7th declaration to the United Nations, he told the UN that he had made 33,000 chemical weapons. But in a version of the dog ate my chemical weapons homework, he said he forgot where he put them. That was in his declaration. And so to not find them there after they were already in the Iraqi declaration tells you, as Paul Harvey would say, that you don't have the rest of the story yet. But I would say that it was clear evidence that they were there. Now, I think things are likely to improve in Iraq because unlike Vietnam, there is no superpower pumping unlimited money and weapons in on the other side. And eventually, a government will emerge that will be in charge of Iraq's #1 asset, the Iraqi National Oil Company, that made $17 billion last year. That's the short term. In the medium term, we face a crisis in North Korea. And the North Korean situation is somewhat different than the situation in Iraq. Just for review, the North Korean crisis grew out of a 1991 decision by the government of North Korea to build nuclear weapons, cut off from the Soviet aid that had supported them for so long, and then cut off by China, that when they did not liberalize, decided to cut them off. North Korea decided to start making plutonium. In 1994, that program had yielded 2 nuclear weapons. And we sent President Carter over there to sign a world-breaking agreement that would say this: in return for shutting down your plutonium reactor, we will give you 2 free nuclear reactors, and we will provide you free fuel oil until those nuclear reactors are finished. A pretty good deal for stopping proliferation in a dangerous part of the world, except for one problem. In 1998, we got information that the North Koreans had started a parallel uranium enrichment program. Remember, the bomb that we dropped on Nagasaki was a plutonium bomb, but the bomb that we dropped in Hiroshima was a uranium bomb. There are 2 main paths to nuclear weapons. While shutting down the plutonium processing part of the North Korean program, the uranium program roared on, despite this agreement with Jimmy Carter. It was ironic that Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, when she left office, said that the North Korean agreement was the #1 achievement of her administration. She said this 2 years after receiving the briefing from the South Koreans that the North Koreans were lying about that agreement. Well, all of this was kept under wraps in the classified world until North Korea's own ambassador, a man I know well, Lee Gun, said to our own ambassador, James Kelly, the Assistant Secretary of State for Near East and Pacific Affairs, you know what? We have been lying. We've been lying for quite some time. We're making nuclear weapons, and we're considering selling them to other countries. This ended the agreed framework that we had and triggered a crisis with North Korea, which is unfolding now. But it's a crisis with a different twist from Iraq. This crisis is one in which we have powerful allies who are as or more scared about what the North Koreans are doing than we are. The #1 country that is upset about what's going on is the government of Japan. Now remember, in the 1990s, the North Koreans have shot missiles over Japanese territory twice, once in 1994 and once in 1998. And the Japanese have been hinting quite strongly for some time now that they are going to review their status as a non-nuclear power. Japan owns more plutonium because of her nuclear reactor program than any other country on Earth. As one wag said, they could become one of the world's largest nuclear powers in a long afternoon. Who would be most affected by a Japanese decision to become a nuclear power? It would be a historic shift of power in Asia against China. And therefore, the Chinese are extremely active now in trying to control their North Korean allies, the people that they backed in the Korean War. This is a case in which, behind the scenes, President Hu Jintao of China is extremely far forward-leaning, ahead of our own president on dealing with the North Koreans. And if you watch closely, you might have seen the recent reports of 150,000 Chinese troops massing on the North Korean border as a not-so-subtle signal that we have backed you in the past, but we do not want you to trigger a nuclear arms race in Asia. They also cut off the natural gas supply to North Korea, giving the message that if you continue down this road, you'll have to run the country on donkey power. This is a country which has spurred enormous allied response. And the United States has huge assets, diplomatic assets, from Japan, from South Korea, and especially from China in solving this problem. Let me close then with one last look at the long term. I've described the short-term problem of Iraq. I've described the medium-term problem of North Korea, in which I think we have strong Chinese support. But there is a long-term challenge. U.S. exports to Europe last year totaled over $140 billion. But U.S. exports to Asia totaled over $440 billion. 4 times exports going to Asia as to Europe. The situation is dramatic even with Illinois, where we export over $200 million more to Asia than to Europe. Asia passed Europe in the importance to Illinois incomes 13 years ago, and we need to update our view of the world based on the economic realities of our trading. China itself already has 240 million cell phone users. And when you look at the growth of the market, they are about to become the world's largest truck market, far eclipsing the United States. 40% of all heavy machinery in the world are sold in one country, China. Half of all construction cranes in the world are in one country, China. This is an economy that the IMF estimates will be larger than the United States in 3 years. I do not want our government to be in the position that the British government was in 1900. In 1900, the view from the British Foreign Office was that they were very worried about the situation in the Sudan and were completely obsessed by a small war in South Africa called the Boer War. And a couple of long-range thinkers in the Foreign Office were looking at the potential of a German threat, but they missed the big story. In 1900, the big story was the rise of America, because in 1900, already America represented half of all the manufacturing in the world. As we look at the North Korean problem and as we look at the Iraqi problem, I want us to have a sense of perspective here, to not miss the big story. And the big story is the rise of China in the 21st century. I think that for our trade policy, China has to dominate now. For our foreign policy, China has to dominate. And for our military planning, China has to dominate. The central relationship in the 20th century was Washington to Moscow. I think the central relationship in the 21st century is Washington to Beijing. I wanted to give you this view, short-term, medium, but especially lay out long-term as to where I think we should go in planning our linguists, in expanding State Department resources, in looking where our key relationships go. One of the key problems for a congressman, a key crime is you cannot be ahead of your time. Winston Churchill paid that price. He was ahead of his time and therefore spent 20 years in the political wilderness until the British public caught up with him. Well, at the risk of being ahead of my time, I think it's all about China. And we need to understand the world as it is becoming in order to advance Illinois incomes, America's trade policy, and also our national security interests. So I lay that out as a long term. At the risk of being a young congressman, I'll be a little bit ahead of my time and say, let's spend a little bit of time focusing on this as we handle the two other programs. Anyway, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Anyone has questions, you can go right to that microphone and just state your name and your question to the congressman. I also forgot, Cardinal Sin is the president, Mr. Ambassador of a volunteer organization. Join the City Club and maybe someday I'll mention your name.
All right. That's right. That's
Anyone
right.
have questions, go right to the mic. Thanks. Remember, you're on TV.
Congressman, I'm David Baker, Vice President of the Illinois Institute of Technology, and I really appreciated your remarks. I think you're right on in that issue. And as an educational institution, we find more and more that we are directly addressing the educational needs of China. We have established strategic relationships with Chinese universities. There's a great interest in educating our Chinese coming to Illinois to be educated, not only at IIT, but other institutions. And in fact, I just addressed 20, just to give you a perspective on this, I just addressed 25 middle-level managers from one province in China that are coming to our institution for an 11-month master's in public administration, entirely paid for by the provincial government just outside of Shanghai. So they are moving ahead aggressively. One of the things, though, that is really daunting for us and other institutions is the visa issue. And it seems to me that I don't know how much you've heard about this from your constituents, but it seems like the consular offices are still treating Chinese as members of some developing country, and they refuse to let bright scientists and graduate students into our country. So over and over again, we enroll them. They have the financial means, and they're stopped by our consular officers. And I wonder if you have a comment on that or know about the problem.
We do, and we want to run the government so that we no longer legally admit under a visa a terrorist that hijacks an airliner. There has to be an assurance of the person presenting themselves to the U.S. consular office is really who he or she says they are. So our plan, I'm on the Appropriations Committee that funds the State Department. Our plan is in 2005 to institute the retinal scan. That is the hardest part of physical identification to mimic. And that hopefully will loosen up considerably the paperwork tie-up right now. The old paper passport is something that was easily forgeable 30 years ago. And I think in an era of a war on terror is not adequate to protect the country. My hope is with the retinal scan, we can then free up the system. And we don't see a significant terror threat from China right now. And once we can assure the person is who they are and match that, I think things will free up considerably.
Thank you.
Congressman, thank you very much for your remarks on international affairs. I want to ask you about something a bit more close to home in a daily sense, and that is, I understand Governor Blagojevich has named you to this regional task force to evaluate the agencies that are helping to deliver planning and transportation across the six-county northeastern Illinois region. And this has been constituted to take a look at possibly coming up with new models for that type of service delivery. I wonder if you could give us just a little bit of an idea of how you're going to approach that responsibility and what values you think are really distinct in that activity.
Yeah. I think being the transportation hub of the country is essential to our economy. That's why I'm a little separate from our junior senator. I've been pro-O'Hare all along. And I think that I just read the book. I hope you all get a chance, especially at this club, The City of the Century, which is what the TV series was based on. When you read that book, oh really? Good. It's Donald Miller is speaking here for your centennial, yes. It's an excellent book, and it highlights our role as the transportation hub of the nation. This is a unique place where, with a 20-mile canoe portage, you connect the entire Great Lakes watershed with the Mississippi watershed, which is why the city was created. With some foresight at the railroads, we became the center of the railroad industry, and with some foresight on aviation, we became that. I think modernizing O'Hare is critical to attracting other employers like Boeing. The average pay in the Boeing building is $250,000. That's the kind of employer you want to attract to Illinois. For the Regional Transportation Authority, I think it's critical that we update where we're going. But one thing I don't want to do, I don't want to have the city of Chicago take over suburban transit. And here's the reason why. Prior to the RTA, if you look at the history, CTA was constantly running out of money. If you look at the headlines from the 1960s, you see constant interruptions in service and a completely lax financial basis for running of the mass transit. Since the creation of the RTA, you have a stable funding source. You know, it's not part of our experience to see the CTA shut down for lack of money. But that is some way because I think we have this overarching authority. So much so that now Metra is rated as the most financially sound and strong transit agency in the nation, which puts us at the top of the list for federal funding for future projects. We had 4 new starts for Metra in the last round of transportation funding. We're going back to the Congress for 2 new starts next time, the Circle Line for the city and the $1 billion Star Line serving the northwest suburbs. So I want to look on this group, but maybe from a different perspective than what some other does, of long-term financial strength and making sure we preserve that, because that has already lifted us to the top of the federal funding pile. We don't want to repeat where the CTA was in the 1960s. And we certainly don't want to have some sort of a regional transit agency like Seattle, which is becoming the embarrassment of all transit agencies in the country. What works here has worked very well and put us at the top, and we want to keep it.
Hi, I'm Grant Linsky, member of City Club. I concur with your comments about the Far East, particularly with China. However, I want to talk to you about something that's going on in this country right now. There's a lot of controversy over the Patriot Act and whether it's going to get really fully implemented. Could you please address your views about where you think this is going to go and why it should,
Right.
or shouldn't?
I voted for the Patriot Act, and the Patriot Act has an urban mythology about it. We all know that the Patriot Act suspended the Fourth Amendment. We all know the Patriot Act allows police to come into your home at any time without a warrant. We all know the Patriot Act allows the government to tap your phone whenever they feel like it, right? Oh, also, by the way, the Patriot Act requires a national ID card. No. Each one of those ideas, while in early drafts of the Patriot Act, were rejected by the Congress. We've said no to national ID cards. We said no to warrantless searches. We said no to administrative wiretaps. The one thing we said yes to, one of the most controversial parts of the Patriot Act, is we did update wiretap law. Wiretap law was based on 1950s technology. When the law was first written, this is how the technology worked. The Bell system laid one hard wire into your home, and that was your one phone line. And so to tap that one line, you needed a judge to sign a warrant. This was interpreted in later editions as the technology changed to requiring a judge to go back and get a warrant for every phone line that goes into the house. Now, many suburban houses have 2 or 3 lines in the house. And for every cell phone, and, you know, for example, the average North Chicago drug dealer will operate with a pillowcase full of 10 cell phones. You need a judge's warrant for each cell phone and a separate warrant for each email account. And the September 11th hijackers generally operated off of 26 or 30 free email accounts like Hotmail or Yahoo. And we forced law enforcement to go back to the judge for every new email account. Well, to fill out a warrant takes about 3 hours. To start a new Yahoo account takes about 15 seconds. So we decided to shift the burden from requiring a warrant for every email account so that the warrant just covers the target, however he communicates. And that was, I think, a warranted, excuse the word, update in the law that actually reflected a technology in which terrorists operate with pillowcases full of cell phones and have 20 or 30 email accounts they're working on. Now, there has been a real problem with how librarians are treated. And recently, I voted to defund the enforcement of the Patriot Act provision on librarians, because I don't think that we should be about throwing the Wilmette librarian in jail. I think that was an overreaching part. And the problem you have as a member of Congress is you're given a 600-page bill, and the vote is yes or no on the whole thing. Had I had the chance, I would have deleted the librarian provision. There have been proposals for a new Patriot Act, including a very controversial proposal for what they call administrative subpoenas, not going to a judge. I totally oppose that. We always have to have someone not working for the president, who is an independent, lifetime federal appointee, review the warrant. I think that's the heart of our Fourth Amendment privacy rights. I really don't see, here I am speaking as a moderate Republican, very many of my colleagues supporting administrative subpoenas. And so while some people in the Justice Department may advocate it, I'm giving it about a 90% no vote in the Congress by my estimation. So I don't think it's going to happen.
Hi, Congressman. My name is Kathy Thomas, City Club member and president of the Chicago Republican Women's Network. Great to see you in Chicago again. This is terrific. You're talking about jobs. This has been, mostly it was obviously foreign policy, but regarding jobs in here locally, a lot of manufacturing jobs have left. Now electronics manufacturing is going to Asia. And they're also now moving engineering of the manufacturing over to Asia. And now customer service jobs are going to India. So, international trade and all of that is great, but what is or can Congress do to help somehow with that situation to prevent all these other types of jobs to continue to go overseas?
I think number one, do no harm. And so the president, my understanding, is about to lift the steel tariff, which is probably the single greatest job loser policy that he's advocated. Yeah, so. And I represent a district of steel users. And I think the job loss to job gain ratio has been 10-to-1 on the steel tariff. And I'm glad he's doing that, because we've seen a lot of steel using. This is a particular Chicago issue where we are steel users and stampers and fitters and not particularly steel makers. Secondly, I think my role has been, as a local congressman, while we support Alan Greenspan and what the president's doing to restart the economy, and the news from the markets looks good for the last 3 months, my job is to focus here at home. And that's number one, as I talked about, the O'Hare Project, 700,000 jobs right here, and re-solidifying our place as the center of the aviation industry, which I think is critical. And then the other upgrades. Let me tell you my favorite other upgrade, which is a project my Democratic colleague, but really my leader on transportation issues, Bill Lipinski, has advocated, and that's the new rail plan for the southern part of Chicago. Factoid: cargo arriving in Los Angeles and moving to Chicago takes 2 days. Cargo going from New York and arriving in Chicago takes 2 days. To transit the Chicago rail yard takes 2 days because of our outmoded system. In an economy of just-in-time delivery and low inventory, we can't have that. So we have a proposal for a $1 billion rail upgrade. This is a rare case in which the entire project is not in my congressional district, and I still support it because I think it has national implications and we need to do it now. Jeffrey.
Jeff Berkowitz, host and producer of Public Affairs, airing every Monday night, 8:30, Channel 21, CAN TV. Tonight's guest is Jan Schakowsky, 9th Congressional District, Congresswoman, Democrat, showing where fair and balanced she'll be followed over the next few weeks by almost U.S. Senate candidate Steve Rauschenberger and already U.S. Senate candidate in the Republican primary, Jim Oberweis. You talked about the, as you said, the short-run problem of dealing with Iraq and what we've been doing. Let me see if I can take a crack at putting together what I understand to be the consensus Democratic leadership view and see if you might be able to address that. Obviously, I can't speak for the Democratic leadership, but certainly presidential candidates Kerry and Lieberman and Gebhardt, who in one form or another seemed to support the resolution last fall and therefore seemed to be aligned with the military effort, now seem to have the criticism on twofold. One that many of the things you outlined, the time and what we did in World War II to deal with Germany and Japan post-war, they might say it's a somewhat different situation because we're dealing with terrorists, we're dealing with guerrillas, we're dealing with people who are spread out, perhaps among the population in Iraq and coming from other countries. So it's harder to talk about rebuilding Germany, rebuilding Japan in the same sense that we're building Iraq. That's one question. Does that terrorist guerrilla embedded, if you will, embedded Ba'athist make a difference? And two, their criticism seems to be that although we tried, we went to the UN, we did not have the appropriate diplomacy to deal with France, Germany, and a number of other countries so that we could have gotten the UN and those countries a broader coalition involved, at least in the reconstruction, if not in the military effort. Right. 2 points that I hear coming from the Democrats.
Right. First of all, on this is a different situation. It is a different situation. We can't analogize it to any other. I think the terrorist threat is a very direct one. I'm going to Iraq next week, and I'll be meeting with the soldiers of the 4th Infantry Division and asking them, what they face. For me, to run a guerrilla operation, you need dedicated people that will help your cause, and you need bullets. And it's difficult to see where a large, unlimited supply of bullets comes from. If this is a context outside the Cold War, where we don't have the Soviet Union or China making regular deliveries. This is a situation, I think, in which you have to look at the ethnic makeup of Iraq to get a handle somewhat on this problem. A tight focus of a CNN news camera makes you think that all of Iraq is in flames. But when you actually look at the population dynamics of Iraq, a different situation emerges. Who is unhappy and who is happy with us? 60% of Iraq are Sunni Muslims, prevented from any leadership position in academia, in medicine, in the military. And throughout their life with Saddam Hussein have been largely locked out, 60% Shia. And they are the majority, not allowed to participate in their government. They are fairly happy with us. 10% of the country are Kurds. 2 genocide campaigns led off by the Anfal offensive against the Kurds, who are very happy with us. Add that up, that means that 70% of Iraqis are largely happy with the change in government and are looking forward to have a voice in their new government when they didn't have it before. So who is unhappy? The 30% Sunni minority that ran the whole country as if it was a Takriti family enterprise, able to steal all of the oil wealth and use it for their local torture chamber or the palaces and perks that they enjoyed. Are they happy with us? No. No, sir. And they're especially centered in one city, Fallujah and Tikrit, where Saddam Hussein's tribal links are strongest. So is this an entire country in flames? No. With a tight camera focus, it can be made to look that way. But in reality, I think it has a different look to it. And as the new government takes over, representing 70% of the majority locked out, I think the prospects are good. Now, with regard to foreign policy, it's interesting to see governments like France almost acting as if they did not vote in favor of Resolution 1441, which authorized the use of force against Iraq, when they did. But I remember, being in political life, I remember the long negotiation of the UN resolution. It took 5 weeks. We are now in our 2nd week of negotiating the new UN Security Council resolution. I'll make a prediction. In about 1 month's time, we will have a new Security Council resolution. It will authorize a UN force in Iraq, and you will see the Germans and French move in. More importantly, you will see a large Indian army and Turkish army contingent move in. Why? Because it is in their absolute interest to take part in the economic life of the second largest OPEC country. They cannot afford to be locked out for too long. Complain? Yes. Delay? Absolutely. Embarrass the Americans? For whatever reason, you bet. But allow themselves to be locked out of the second largest OPEC country? No.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Congressman, let me switch you to another issue of foreign policy, Israel and the Palestinians.
Yeah.
Last couple of months, the situation seems to be worse than ever. Is roadmap dead, and is there any prospect for peace in the Middle East?
I'm pessimistic. I just finished a mission to Israel with 25 leaders from the JUF, and the day we arrived, the Jerusalem bomb went off. It dramatically clouded our mission. I had a meeting with Mohammed Dalan, Yasser Arafat's security chief. The meeting was canceled, thank God, that morning, because that afternoon the building next to him blew up. I visited a number of victims of the Jerusalem bomb. This is where the suicide bomber walked into the middle of an articulated bus and set off the homicide bomb. And so a few days later, I was in the ICU of Hadassah Hospital, standing over the bed of Esther Zariga. Esther is 8 years old, and this is something that doesn't happen on the North Shore. I've never seen a bomb victim. Let me be graphic for 1 second. When the shock wave goes through the bus, it pulses the gelatinous parts of the human body to a great degree that then swell up. Esther's eyes were bulging out of her head, even though she was in a coma, and she could not close her eyes because of the swelling that was going on in reaction to the blast. Now, her nurse said that things were looking up because the oxygen level in her blood was rising. And so it was likely she was going to come out of the coma, which she did, only to learn that she doesn't have a sister anymore. There's a profound rage that comes in you looking at who would do this to an 8-year-old girl. My feeling over the long haul is that Arafat missed his Nelson Mandela moment. Nelson Mandela, I remember, as a liberation leader, sponsored an armed rebellion against South Africa. It was called the Spear of the Nation. But once he perceived President de Klerk was actually coming to the table with a peace deal, he closed down Spear of the Nation and made that transition and became the father of his nation. Arafat, on the other hand, walked away from Camp David. He thought that the deal that President Clinton was offering him could be improved on the battlefield. And so he ignited the Intifada. President Bush tells a very interesting story about walking into the Oval Office on January 21st, 2001. President Clinton was waiting for him, and they both got into the limousine on their way to the Capitol for the president to transfer the office. And he said the entire ride in the limousine up, President Clinton basically spent the whole time telling then President-elect Bush what a schmuck Arafat was. Do not trust him. He is a terrorist. Do not work with him. President Bush has largely followed that. And I think the sadness about the Middle East is that we're waiting for Arafat to pass on. He's an old man. His hand shakes. He can't have a meeting longer than 45 minutes because he has to go to the bathroom. He's very shaky in his own leadership. And when you ask Palestinians, what do they say? What's the first word that comes into a Palestinian mind when you say Yasser Arafat? They say corrupt, because he's surrounded by a coterie of Mr. 10%. I don't think Israel should kill him. I think that would make him come alive just when he's about to pass on from natural causes. And I do worry about who would replace him. I know on the Israeli side, Israel's always done the right thing for peace. When Sadat, after 3 wars that Egypt had, was ready to throw in the towel, Israel made the tough choice, closed down the settlements in the Sinai, adjusted her borders, and surrendered that territory to get a real peace with Egypt. The same when King Hussein threw in the towel and had a real peace agreement. I have no doubt that Israel will do the same thing. But on the other side, an essential aspect of statehood is to be able to monopolize violence. And at this point in the structure of the Palestinian leadership, no Palestinian leader, when they say no to violence, can have that check be cashed, because someone always then leads another attack. And so there's no one there to deal with. Bottom line for me is that I just hope this little ally hangs in there. And we should stand with her until we get someone who can pass the Nelson Mandela test and become the mother or father of their country.
Thank you, Congressman.
Yeah, thank you.